Okay, hello. Welcome also from me. My name is Alma Hannig. I'm the main coordinator for all university museums and collections in Bonn, and I'm happy to open this first lecture from our lecture interventions that will start today and to introduce our first speaker today. Our first speaker is Professor Helmut Maier from the University of Wuppertal, from the Interdisciplinary Center for Science and Technology Studies. Professor Maier is a historian of science, technology, and environmental history at the University of Wuppertal. He conducts research on the history of mining and energy, historical materials research, and the history of scientific societies and technical universities. In his research group on the history of governmental research in the 20th century, the Prussian Geological Survey and geological research form a thematic focus with 2 staff members. He's co-editor of the anthology Mining and Environment in GDR and FRG, East and West Germany, from 2022, which examines the practices of environmental policy and recultivation. Today he's going to speak about circulations, colonial geology, the Prussian Geological State Institution, and the Southwest African copper. Mr. Maier, the floor is yours.
Perfect, many thanks. The micro is on and you can hear me loud and clear. Okay, many thanks for the warm introduction. I will talk about colonial geology. What is colonial geology? You all know what is geology. And I will address the history of a certain institution, the Prussian Geological State Institution or the Geological Survey, if you wish, and the entanglement and involvement in the Southwest African copper history from the 19th century to the end of the First World War and the end of the German colonial rule in 1919. I will talk about the state of research and explain my interest in this topic, where it came from, gold, diamonds, copper, question mark, and the part that deals with the scientific history or history of science, concepts of circulations, and the colonial knowledge system is the main part of my presentation today. The 2 pictures I show in the beginning may address the dichotomy of this history. It's the dichotomy between the wonders of nature, the wonders of mineralogy on the one hand, the findings, the discoveries in Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, of course, on the one side, and on the other side, this all happens in the context of colonial rule, of German atrocities during this colonial rule, forced labor, and of course a war against the native peoples and the extermination. How about my interest? How came my interest about on this topic? It was already mentioned. We have a larger research project financed or sponsored by the Federal Institute of Economy and Climate Protection. And this was launched in 2020, and one of the institutions that we do research on is in fact the Prussian Geological State Institution or Geological Survey, founded in 1873. Now our interest in the project deals with the history during the National Socialist era and also the decades before, beginning with the First World War. And this is not exactly what we are talking about here, but as we discovered, of course, during our research, prominent figures of the German geological sciences of the survey also, of course, up to 1945 had served as colonial geologists in the German Empire's governmental services long before the First World War, especially in Namibia, the former German Protectorate of Southwest Africa. Now, if we are researching on the question of the topic of colonial history, colonial sciences in a broader scale, the colonial history of Southwest Africa, we have a state of research. And this is, of course, what everybody does in the beginning. And I like to introduce the term of circulations, which will be explained later. For the colonial geology, we only have commemorative titles stemming from former geologists or geological institutions, but no historical analysis or reconstruction of the history of colonial geology. We have one example for the history of the formation of science coming out of colonial history. That is the study of Gräbel. It's the history of geography and the formation of this new scientific discipline in the context and enforced by the colonial context. Other new scientific disciplines also emerged in the colonial context, which is shown by several studies like ethnology, anthropology, tropical medicine, archaeology, and botany. So it is easy to understand that there might be or should be some connection of colonial contexts with the formation of the colonial geology. Now, newer studies like He and Brahm, authors He and Brahm, understand science and technology as stirrup holders for colonial expansion and exploitation. And this is a field of the so-called post-colonial history of knowledge and science, which now understands the connection, the transfer between motherland and colony, not as a one-way transfer of knowledge, personnel, methods, technology, and so forth, from the north to the south, but as a circulation. There is also a variety of studies on Namibia's colonial history, of course, dealing with Bismarckian colonial policy. It's the establishment of the German colonial rule dominated by fraud, insurgency, extermination and genocide, dispossession, forced labor, infrastructure erection, economic history aspects, and so forth. And they generate a master narrative of extermination and failure of the German colonial politics. Now, my question as an historian of science and technology and also institutional historian, are geologists involved in this frame of, and in this master, to explain the master narrative of failure? And of course, the involvement of geologists in the extermination. Now, prominent studies, I name Marion Wallace, for example, Oxford 2011, an older study, Udo Kaulich, History of Southwest Africa up to 1914. There we find geologists mentioned, but there is no answer to be found in the way I ask my questions. So I have to research further. We found an ocean of colonial historical studies in general from the 1970s on. There was a movement among young historians called History from Below, and from here I draw the concept of the complicity of science and technology in colonial crimes. Another standard handbook, so to speak, of Osterhammel and Jansen, talking about colonial history as a knowledge history, not as a history of science and technology, but as a knowledge history, which is quite different. They're speaking about a complex interplay of local and imported epistemologies. embedded in transnational knowledge circuits and exchange relations. And these exchange relations and the circuits remember or show or can be drawn back to the concept of circulations from post-colonial history. Now, geologists are also, of course, mentioned in the studies on the history of the mining companies, like Drexler, 1996, on the major land and mining companies, corporate history, and we have a corporate history from Heidi Schnorbus, the history of the Otavi mines and railway company. Then there is also, of course, a historiography on pre-colonial history of Namibia, and there you can find some aspects or information on the use of copper in the native peoples in Southwest Africa, and already the Otavi mountain region is mentioned. I come to my second chapter, so to speak, the research topic on the circulations, Colonial Geologists, the Institute, and the copper. Research topics are the unfolding of the colonial geological knowledge system and the role of science in the development of colonial resources. Second, significance of geological mining expeditions, adventurous state and mining societies for the geology as a science in a disciplinary understanding like theory, method, subject matter. Third, the colonial geological knowledge system as institutional history of institutions in the motherland and the colony, the mining authorities, and also mineralogical chemical laboratories. Fourth, the question of circulations. What is circulating? Personnel, material, ore samples, mineral collections, but also knowledge, like also practices of ore processing and smelting, which relates to the history of metallurgy and mining. And of course, fifth, the involvement of geologists in the genocide. Now let's become historians and tell a story of how copper comes into play. In the first place, it was gold and diamonds, and it's a worldwide phenomenon, gold rushes, diamond rushes, that can be observed in the 19th century. And we have in 1866 diamond discoveries in South Africa, the Kimberley mine. Then we had gold discoveries, Transvaal, and for certain scientific reasons, geologists, mineralogists, of course, expected similar findings in Southwest Africa because of the similarity of the geological formations. So a lot of expeditions were started in order to discover gold and diamonds in the 1880s. Then the expectations were so high, were extremely high, that even Australian diggers could launch a fraud, and they even managed to sell such concessions for big money to some German companies. And these fake gold samples were even presented to the German Reichstag. So this is an anecdote. I couldn't avoid this anecdote to show the over expectations, and all these expectations in gold, diamonds, but also other minerals. Also coal was one of the objects of interest, were disappointed. And as a contemporary put it in 1891, Gürich, quote, "our so hopeless protectorate." And good news from the colonies are absolutely scarce, end quote. So this was an absolute, complete failure, these interventions and expeditions. Now copper comes into play. I marked in the map, I marked the Otavi region, And already there was knowledge about pre-colonial copper use in Southwest Africa. Native copper mining probably occurred from 500 BC onwards. There were early written reports, one of them from Galton, 1851, and they directed to a region 19 kilometers north of Tsumeb, where there were natives observed that transported ore and copper. And in 1857, Rhenish missionaries observed the transport of copper. Finally, in 1897, the expectations were fulfilled. 1897, the sensational findings, Tsumeb in the Otavi Mountains, the famous Green Hill, which you might know, and the name Tsumeb even occurs on a big number of the samples I saw here in the exhibition. The Green Hill, why green? It's the mineral malachite. It's a copper mineral, and this also directs to the copper content of these minerals. And unfortunately, the photograph here is not colored. So this is a photograph, a contemporary photograph of the early 20th century of the Green Hill, which already disappeared because this was all extracted and processed and shipped to Europe. Now, the findings are sensational, and why I like to show with my pictures, which I got from Wilson 1977. The Green Hill advanced to be the Galapagos of mineralogists. As you can see here, I quote Redlich, 1955, Tsumeb ranks as one of the highest grade base metal deposits in the world. It is geologically and mineralogically famous for 41 copper, lead, zinc, vanadium, and germanium ore minerals, but its complex mineral assemblage is not attractive to metallurgists. So here we see, on the other hand, the euphoria of the mineralogists, and on the other hand, the problems for the metallurgists, because the question is, how can you process such a combination of contents of minerals? Now, in fact, there was an extraordinary content of base metals, which you can see here, the metal content of the ore deposit and the geological conditions of the Tsumeb mine, published by Schneiderhöhn, his field research from 1916. So you have exorbitant metal contents like up to 15% of copper, which is absolutely the maximum worldwide. Now, why is copper of interest? We are moving through the second industrial revolution, where you have new industries like electrical engineering and electrical industries, and you have electrification all over the world. So copper gets in another era of use on a vast industrial scale. So copper advanced to become a strategic raw material, not only for the industry, but also for armaments production. Between 1880 and 1913, worldwide copper production increased tenfold. In 1900, the Otavi Mining and Railway Company was founded, the OMAC, and in 1903, they started the construction of the Swakopmund to Tsumeb railroad line. And in the map, I marked these two places, the Tsumeb mine, Otavi Mountains, and then the Swakopmund harbor at the Atlantic Ocean. And without infrastructure and railroad building, you cannot ship these ores to smelters. Now, in the historiography, there is a certain aspect I have to bring in here. That is that the building of the railway was mentioned as one of the triggers. There are a lot of factors that triggered the Herero uprising in 1904, that one of the authors, the prominent authors, Drexler, mentioned that, in fact, the Otavi railway was one of the triggers of the uprising. Well, the question is why, and he argues it's the loss of the Herero's most fertile grazing grounds, because the OMEC demanded from the Herero not only the gracious concession of the land needed for railroad construction, but in addition, the gracious transfer of the land on both sides of the railroad line in blocks, each 20 kilometers wide and 10 kilometers deep, together with the water rights within these blocks, end quote. The uprising, of course, everybody knows that, you should know this, ended in a genocide. Up to 60,000 Herero and about 10,000 Nama lost their lives, killed by the German colonial rule. On the other hand, the dividends popped up, the profits. It was extremely profitable, the Tsumeb mine. You can see here the scale in percent from 1907 onwards. You have a 10% dividend, which is already extremely high, which then pops up to 40% dividend. Unbelievable numbers, which are can be seen here. Okay, my fourth chapter, so to speak, I like to talk about the colonial geological knowledge system. And I like to answer the question how geologists are involved and how this system emerged that allowed for the finally the extraction of the copper. Now, I already mentioned in 1873 the foundation of the Prussian Geological Survey for the survey of Prussia. Then from 1884 onwards, we talk about the colonial research period of geology. That is, from this time onwards, we see experts, geologists, mineralogists in certain expeditions in Southwest Africa, hired by entrepreneurs such as Lüderitz. And in this period, we see the formation of colonial geology as a certain aspect of field in geology and mineralogy. Geological expeditions were launched and adventurous mining expert geologists did field research in these vast territories, punctual field work. In the map that you can see here shows the ownership or the rights, the concessions, the right concessions for mining of the mining companies in 1914, and as you can see, I marked again the Otavi mountain region. This is a complex situation. There are several mining companies that had concessions, that hold concessions in this region. Now, this list, I published this in the Journal of Namibian Studies. I will not go through this list, of course not. This list might show how expertise is involved in a growing extent. Expertise meaning it is mineralogists, it's geologists, it's geographers, of course, but it's mainly geologists that now are hired for expeditions. And it is also the commercial interest. If you start with the first, Eichmeier, there is this central institution for mining in Frankfurt, erected by a consortium of mining and metallurgical companies, and they hired qualified geologists for these expeditions. So now we have a turn from a pre-colonial period to the formation of colonial geology, now to a standardized procedure of hiring and sending out experts which are able to understand the geological formations in Southwest Africa. And this goes on, and also more and more the PGLA, the Prussian Geological Survey, comes into play. 1904, Heinrich Lotz, Erwin Semper, and you see 1904, the uprising, the Herero uprising is the context, and even the later president of the Prussian Geological Survey, Paul Krusch, had a history in Southwest Africa. This goes on up to 1914-19. That is the last one in this table. Hans Schneiderhöhn, who became very famous for geologists, for the discipline of geology. Now, also involved are the German metal and electrical companies. I already mentioned it is the context of a boom, electrification, electrical industry, telephone. You need copper for armament and so forth. So you have very prominent companies, Metallbank, Metallurgische Gesellschaft, Frankfurt. You have the AEG, the General Electrical company or association with the famous Walter Rathenau, who even himself visited Southwest Africa. And you have also cable manufacturers, of course, who entered the consortiums in order to exploit Southwest African copper. Also from the government side, already in 1891, but this is only a halfway step, so to speak. We see the establishment of a colonial mining authority, but this was not a state or government authority. This was a colonial authority. This changed in 1904, which is not written on these slides, but there we have then an officially governmental empire, German empire's colonial authority. Now, the question is how the PGLA now acted and became, I called it a central knowledge repository. In 1902, the PGLA founded a colonial department and a colonial museum. The Colonial Museum, of course, collected the geological, mineralogical samples that came in from the German colonies. The PGLA, I quote, "The Colonial Museum turned out to be more and more extensive." I already mentioned it because of the numerous influxes of material, as you can see here and all over in all mineralogical and geological institutes in Germany. At the same time, the deposit and other geological technical collections, the laboratories and the library served as a central point of contact for men of all professions who intended to emigrate in the interest of the colonial cause and to prepare themselves for their task. And it was easy for me to find pictures in the World Wide Web that address Southwest Africa, ZooMap, which is openly shown. These are all probes that were collected during these eras. Now the question is, what was circulating? And can we reconstruct some examples of this circulation and the character of this circulation, also in the sense of history of science or knowledge history? Circulations, we have seen geologists, mining engineers, then we see minerals migrating, but we also see processing, smelting technologies applied and circulating, and of course it's the circulation of knowledge. Now in 1904, the government geologists were dispatched to Southwest Africa, or samples were sent out and shipped to the North German copper smelting society, the Norddeutsche Affinerie Hamburg, also to Great Britain. Central mining companies are involved, the Metallgesellschaft Consortium for Geology, and the technological side is barely researched on. As example, I present here the primary crushers on the west side of open cast showing men and women sorting ore, date about 1912. So it's also always the question of metallurgy and the processing of the ore itself. Then in 1910, we see the beginning of the training of mining engineers for colonial services. Lectures were given in the PGLA for the officials of the empire's colonial office, Reichskolonialamt, and under the title Introduction to the Geology and Soil of the German Colonies. Then in the metallurgical industries, we see experiments which were published during this time. This is easy to find, not exactly easy, but you can find it in the contemporary journals of metallurgical sciences and technology. Experiments were occurred with new processing like wet processing, and also smelting technologies, which exactly were adapted to the ore composition that came from the Otavi region. Then I have the mining syndicate established a mineralogical chemical laboratory in Swakopmund. Now we have a new laboratory. This is important for the understanding of the system in full swing. It's, so to speak, the system in full swing. We have now a new laboratory in Swakopmund, which is open to all adventurers, private persons, companies, and so forth, in analyzing the minerals that are collected in the vast regions of Southwest Africa. Finally, and I stress it in red, in 1912, the foundation of the Geological Central Office for the German protected areas in the PGLA. So this is, so to speak, the end point in the institutional perception, the institutional history. So the Prussian Geological Survey in the first place in the 1870s, then in the context of colonialism, begins to adapt to the questions of colonial geology, and then in 1912, with some other steps in between, the museum, for example, we have the foundation of a central office for the German protected areas. Now, I will address the history of a certain geologist, Hans Schneiderhuhn, who became very famous because he was hired to explore the geological formation of the Otavi Mountains. And he was hired for 3 months in 1914, and he went to Southwest Africa, and he started to research on the geological formations, and then we have the outbreak of the First World War, and he had much more time to explore and reconstruct how this how these ore bodies are formed. And this is an important final step because it now closes the loop, so to speak, to the mother discipline of geology. Because he developed, in the first place, he developed a microscopic method. It's the method of examination of light impermeable ore minerals. And he did this so-called systematic methodology on a crystal optic basis using polarized light. So this is physics, this is chemistry, this is a new method. So this contributes to the methods and revolutionizes the methods of geology in total. But also, and this is in red, he deciphered the complex deposit forming processes and related genetic systematics of ore deposits on a physicochemical basis, which is also a new quality for geology and also mineralogy, of course, now applying the laws, the theories of physicochemistry to geology. So he can then find new explanations for the formation of these ore bodies, which couldn't be done in the way before, because now these physicochemical theories are applied. So this together makes him very famous, and as I said, it closes the loop. Now let me conclude. I call geology a stirrup holder of colonial exploitation and extermination. First, the mining expeditions for copper by adventurers, state and commercial geologists paved the way and legitimized the colonial politics in Germany. Second, the Colonial Geological knowledge system consisted of a larger number of institutions in which the Prussian State Geological Survey became the nerve center for the organization, collection of knowledge, and preparing outgoing experts. Third, the circulation of personnel and knowledge, ore samples, mineral collections, practices of ore processing and smelting finally led to the formation of new laboratory geological methods and theories. And finally, fourth, the role of government geologists in the war against the Namibian peoples is still an open question and field of research. Thank you much for your attention.